Hello, everyone. I'm Ben Norton. You are watching a live stream of Moderate Rebels and also the Gray Zone. I mean, they're very similar. My co host Max Blumenthal will be joining us in a little bit. We're starting this episode, which will also be posted afterward as a podcast for anyone who wants to just listen as opposed to watching here on YouTube or on Twitch over at twitch.tv/Moderate Rebels. But I'm joined by my colleague Aaron Maté. Aaron just got back from a trip to Syria, on the ground in Syria, and set off a firestorm across liberal media and Twitter and all of the blue check marks who were calling him a genocide denier and a conspiracy theorist and a bootlicking Assadist. So, Aaron, I just want to start off this interview asking, what is it like to love Bashar al-Assad and to lick his boots?
You know what's interesting, and I think you guys have experienced this too before. You being in Nicaragua, and whenever you guys go to Venezuela, once you get on the ground of the places that are so demonized and entire countries that are like reduced to a cartoon portrayal of one person, in this case Assad, you realize just how irrelevant all those people are back home who sit in front of their computers and whitewash dirty wars like the one that was brought to Syria. So honestly, that whole thing was, I didn't, like when the Young Turks put out that clip of me saying that I'm paid by Russia and that I defend the killing of babies, I didn't even have the time to think about it much because, I was in a place that's actually been impacted by the sadistic dirty war that all these people who attack me are either completely ignorant of or who actively cheerlead, who consciously cheerlead a crime against a country. So it's just interesting always to be abroad and in the place that is impacted by people's ignorance and sadism that I usually live around, but was fortunate to escape for, a couple of days.
And Aaron, could you just talk about some of your report back thoughts, like the overall thoughts you had about your trip to Syria, what it was like, what lessons you learned, just in a nutshell, how did it change you as a person?
Well, to be honest, I came away filled with rage. That's my main takeaway. It's just anger. It's anger that, I'll channel productively, but you can't help but feel that way when you tour what was a once stable country. Before the war, it had one of the best medical systems in the Middle East, universal healthcare for all its citizens, had one of the best education systems. It was self-sufficient in food production with people's caloric intake at a level that's on par with Western countries, which is considered to be the top in the world. And you see all that destroyed because their government was outside the control of the hegemony of the US and its allies. And it suffered a dirty war as a result. And you saw what was some initial protests calling for democratic reforms being simultaneously co-opted and turned into a dirty war that may have been planned well before, for all we know. There's a lot of evidence pointing in that direction. So I was angry seeing a country that was once stable, full of just people trying to live their lives, being decimated and now being punished. Now the Syrian people are being punished for the fact that their government defeated the US and its allies. So these sanctions now preventing Syria from rebuilding, preventing people from importing cancer medicines, punishing average Syrians for something that they had nothing to do with, and for the fact that their country simply didn't want to be under the dictates of the US government. So you can't meet all these people face to face. You can't feel the complicity that I have as a Western citizen and not walk away from that just feeling angry. And especially when you compare the reality on the ground to the picture we got as Western citizens, just the nonstop propaganda that was used every single day, every single year for 10 years to justify flooding a country with weapons and fighters, letting Turkey letting tens of thousands of foreign jihadists come from around the world to wage jihad and destroy this country. And our media here in the US calling all these people rebels and freedom fighters, and not just our corporate media, but our progressive media too. So there's anger in seeing that. And there's also a certain irony in there's all this talk now, there's all this condemnation of Syria's authoritarianism. They just had this election. Assad was reelected with like 96% of the vote. And I'm sure that this vote was not accurate. I have a hard time believing that 96% of the Syrian people voted for Assad. People told me that they thought that the vote was inflated. I would bet that they're right. But I also think it's so ridiculous for a Western citizen to complain or focus on authoritarianism in Syria and profess to be concerned about the well-being of the Syrian people. When, if we really cared about authoritarianism in Syria and the well-being of the Syrian people, there is an authoritarianism we can do something about. And it happens to be the worst form of authoritarianism that Syrians are currently facing. And that is the US regime, after destroying the country, deciding that it has the right to flood a country with weapons and fighters. And after losing that war, which left the country largely in ruins, after losing it, then deciding that it has the right to impose sanctions that prevent it from rebuilding. That's a far more extreme form of authoritarianism than anything you can accuse Syria of. Syria's authoritarianism is inside its borders, and Syria's system is Syrians' business. People in Washington, with the consent of the entire media class, have decided that it's their right to destroy a prosperous and stable country. That's like the harshest form of authoritarianism I can think of. And you can see the impact because people, that war was catastrophic. And now you can see the suffering under sanctions. There are long lines for fuel. People who can afford it, can afford to pay the inflated prices. But otherwise, people have to survive on a very low stipend of fuel every month. That's just not enough for them to get around. And then you compound that with all the other deprivations that result from strangling a country with the most intrusive sanctions program in the world right now, where any country wanting to do business with Syria, help it rebuild, can't do so, and because they'll be targeted by the U.S. or any company as well. And what's amazing is that, so we complain here about Syrian authoritarianism, but our authoritarianism passes by without even comment. So you read an article about Syria's suffering right now in the Washington Post or the New York Times. At best, you'll get a passing mention of the U.S. sanctions buried at the bottom. At best. Sometimes they don't even mention it. So my other big takeaway from Syria is that if we're concerned about authoritarianism there, we have a very easy solution as citizens of the West. We can stop our own immediately.
Yeah, well, I want to bring in, we have our other two guests today. My co-host Max Blumenthal is joining us, and Professor Mohammad Marandi is joining us. I believe, Professor Marandi, you're in Iran right now, right? I think he might be frozen. So, oh, there we go. Hi, Professor Marandi, can you hear us?
Yes, I'm not sure, though, how stable my connection is.
It looks and sounds great from where we are.
Okay, good.
Are you joining us from Iran today, Professor Marandi?
Yes, the heart of the axis of evil. You can hear the heartbeat if you listen carefully.
Well, Professor Marandi,
or the axis of resistance, yes.
Professor Marandi, you
resistance is evil, so it's synonymous from our point of view here. So no need to clarify. Go ahead, Ben.
Anything that resists U.S. hegemony is evil. But Professor Marandi, you also joined Aaron on this trip to Syria. Can you talk about your experience in Syria and what you took away from it?
Yes, and if there's a problem with my connection, just cut me off at any point that you think necessary. I've actually been to Syria quite often, both before the dirty war and after the dirty war. In fact, I've been going to Syria regularly since 2013. The first time I went to Syria when things were really bad was in late May 2013, right before or during the first Hezbollah operation in Qusayr on the border between Lebanon and Syria, because Lebanon was also becoming deeply terrorized, or it was becoming dangerously close to becoming a part of the dirty war in Syria. So Hezbollah began its first operation, I think, in early April 2013, the first 2-3 days of April in that area. And I happened to be in Syria for the first time when that operation began. And that is actually an important point to make, because Iran's involvement in Syria and Hezbollah's involvement in Syria only really began in mid-2013, 2 years after the dirty war began. And I know you are all very well versed on Syria, and Max has a very good book on the topic, and I've seen the very good articles on Gray Zone discussing the different topics, the alleged chemical attacks, and so on. So I'm not going to go into detail, but tens of thousands of foreign fighters were already in Syria when Hezbollah got involved, and they were mostly funneled in through Turkey, some through Lebanon, and quite a few from Jordan. And so by the time the Iranians really got involved was when these extremist groups were moving in for the kill, and they had taken large parts of Damascus. So when I was in Damascus, and I told Aaron, because we happened to meet we were both at the same hotel, and I told him that when I first came to this hotel, there was artillery fire constantly going on. And on my second trip to Syria, which was a few months, I think on my third trip to Syria, which was about a year later, early 2014, a shell actually hit right beside the hotel, killing a couple of people on the street. I think I showed the area, the place to Aaron. So that was the state of affairs when the Iranians became involved. So those who accuse Iran of being, crushing the Syrian people and the revolution, Iran and Hezbollah had nothing to do with Syria in the way they claim, until well after ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups had established themselves in the country. And Iran's involvement, in my opinion, was basically to save the region from these extremist groups that were unleashed by NATO, the Israelis, and oil-rich and energy-rich countries in the Persian Gulf region. But on this particular trip, what I thought was interesting was that although the military situation and the security situation in the country had stabilized, but the economic situation was very difficult, much more difficult than before. And it's because of the Caesar sanctions and EU sanctions that are targeting ordinary people. In other words, the Americans and Mr. Erdogan and Netanyahu and the EU and others, they failed in their dirty war, which killed hundreds of thousands of people. And now they want to take revenge by strangling the population. And when Iran tries to send crude oil to Syria, the Americans and their allies and the EU try to block it, or the Israelis try to strike those tankers. So that, it's not as if those tankers are going to President Assad's house. They are being used by ordinary people to drive around in cars to get on with their lives. But the Europeans and the Americans want to strangle Syria, just as they helped the Saudis strangle the people of Yemen. It's not as if this is something all that shocking. We saw what happened in Libya. We see what's happening in Venezuela and what's been happening in Cuba, and I often use the example of Nicaragua, where for me ISIS and Al-Qaeda and these other groups are somewhat like the Contra rebels, where the Americans, they use them to crush the Sandinistas, and then ultimately people voted when there were elections, people voted for the pro-American party basically to end the misery, not because they wanted them. So the Americans pretend as if this was a victory for democracy. No, it was a victory for the Godfather, who was intimidating a whole nation and intimidates nations across the world into abiding by their demands. And that's one reason why I really don't buy the argument that Syria is a police state or an awful dictatorship. True, Syria is not an ordinary country, but Syria is not facing ordinary circumstances. When I, during over these years when I go to Syria, I've regularly visited and lectured at different universities, whether it's the University of Damascus or Aleppo or the university in Latakia. And I've spoken to students, extensively. They are often very critical, some more, some less. Some love President Assad, some like him, some just don't like the alternative that the Europeans and the Americans are offering in Idlib. And I'm sure in Idlib it's not a police state; it's a democratic
Professor Marandi, there's a
government.
Disneyland in Idlib now.
Yeah, I hear. Yeah, they give discounts for international visitors, from what I hear. So I don't buy the argument. In Syria, I've always felt comfortable among students on campus alone. And I've been to Saudi Arabia 4 times. I've spent 4 months in Saudi Arabia. I've been to other countries in the Persian Gulf region, which I won't name, and I've felt much more restricted than Syria now, than Syria today. I'm not saying that Syria is a democracy, and I don't have an expectation for it to be a democracy. So if someone tells me, Venezuela is not practicing democracy in the way in some sort of idealistic way, it can't. If I was a leader in Venezuela and a foreign power was trying to overthrow me and use sanctions to manipulate the people and use the internet to turn the public in a particular way, obviously I would be taking measures to prevent them from carrying out regime change. The United States has accused the Russians, as you all have dealt with, you've all dealt with this extensively. Russiagate, bringing Trump to power through, the forces in Kremlin, which if that really was the case, that just shows that the United States is not really a superpower. But regardless of whether it was a legitimate claim, which it wasn't, but let's assume it was, it was 4 years of crisis in the United States because of this accusation. And then compare that to a small country like Syria. Syria is much smaller than Iran. It's much, much smaller than the United States. And this country is being destroyed through a dirty war where ISIS and Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda are being supported by the Israelis alongside the Golan Heights. We know this. I mean, the documentation is there, and your own website has a lot of information on this, and Max's book is there's more than enough evidence. I've written a few articles. People could look it up through those articles as well. Look up the information. You had tens of thousands of foreign fighters coming in from Turkey. You had literally hundreds of billions of dollars being pumped into the country. I told Aaron that during the dirty war, during the height of the dirty war, the Syrian currency was stable, even though the country was being destroyed. The reason was because there was so much money being pumped into the country. So much money was being pumped into the country from countries in the Persian Gulf, from Turkey, from NATO countries, from the United States and elsewhere, that the country that was falling apart, city after city was being destroyed, factories were being dismantled and taken to Turkey, people were being forced to move en masse from one city to another. The currency was stable. That's how much money was being pumped into the country as it was being destroyed. So you cannot, I mean, no one can expect any country to behave normally under abnormal circumstances. And whether the votes in Syria were inflated and whether they were accurate, there's no doubt for those who've been to Syria that President Assad has a lot of popular support. You can see it through the gatherings that they existed across the country. Someone can say they were all busting. Well, that's what they always say, that sort of thing. Why can't the Saudi? Why isn't the Egyptian government, which has so much international support, why can't they bust in so many people to support General Sisi? If Assad is so competent, then he deserves to be in power. He was able to prevent all these countries from overthrowing his government. If he didn't have some sort of popular support, how could he resist ISIS and Al Qaeda? I mean, true, Iran supported Syria. True, Hezbollah supported Syria. But I mean, if there was no popular support, how could Iran and Hezbollah stand up against the whole of NATO and the whole of the region and all the money that was being pumped into Syria? Iran was always sanctioned. Iran always had limited reserves. How could Syria ever survive if President Assad didn't have that sort of popular support? And what I find exceptionally disturbing is that a lot of these Western reporters, and I won't name them, but I know them by name. I've met many of them. Western reporters based in Turkey, in mainstream journals, every single one of them know this. Every single one of them know how ISIS got into Syria. Again, when I was speaking to Aaron, I told him that a senior former intelligence official, I won't name him here. I tried to contact him today to get permission to say this on the show, but I couldn't get through to that person, so I won't. But Aaron knows who I'm talking about. A senior intelligence official who was deeply involved in the 1980s in Afghanistan, in the war in Afghanistan during the 1980s. A very senior person who the three of you have heard his name before. In 2011, I was in Lebanon. I was on sabbatical in Lebanon. This gentleman he was in Lebanon. He told me that this is a NATO-led dirty war in 2011. And I said, how do you know? He said, because the people who I worked with in Pakistan and in Afghanistan are now all in Istanbul. He said that to me back then. And now we know from WikiLeaks, from February 2012, that Jake Sullivan, who is now the National Security Advisor of the President of the United States, he said in an email to Hillary Clinton that in Syria, Al Qaeda is on our side, literally a decade after 9/11. So
that was the epigraph to my book. I was just like, it's such a perfect quote. So
it's extraordinary. I mean, if someone had told me in 2012 that 10 years from now the United States would be working with Al Qaeda in Libya, in Syria, and indirectly in Yemen, although it's more complicated in Yemen, but Al Qaeda and ISIS are both fighting alongside the Saudis as we speak in Yemen. If someone had told me that, I would have said they were mad, they were crazy. That's absolutely impossible. But that's the reality that we live with today. So what I'm saying is that those who say that Assad is a mass murderer, and it's easy to say that, it's you don't get any trouble for saying that. We get all sorts of trouble for saying that sort of for denying this. I would say that if there is any blood on President Assad's hand, there's infinitely more blood on the hands of Obama and other Western leaders and regional leaders who started this dirty war. It's like saying that Ortega or the Sandinistas, there's blood on their hands because the Contra rebels, and they were fighting with the Contra rebels, and civilians were dying in different cities in Nicaragua, so they have blood on their hands. Well, they're defending their country. a foreign power has launched a dirty war against them, and they're defending their country. And let me
Professor
add one
Marandi,
final point.
Yeah, but before,
Yeah, sure.
I'll come back to you in a second, but just while we're talking about Nicaragua, I'm actually here in Nicaragua right now, and there's so many parallels between Syria and Nicaragua. I'm so glad you brought it up because the dirty war, the same tactics they used against Nicaragua and also against Afghanistan when it had a socialist government in the 1980s. It's the same tactics they use in Syria, and to such a degree that actually, I just tweeted this. I'm going to post this on the screen for people watching, that in the 1980s, the so-called Contras, who were entirely created and funded by the U.S. government in every single way, specifically by the CIA, they accused the Nicaraguan government of fake chemical weapons attacks, and they staged fake attacks. This has actually all been confirmed because I've been doing more research on what we know, because what happened is back in the 1980s, there were still some members of the Democratic Party who were kind of against war a little bit, and I know, a crazy idea to think about now, but back in the 80s, the Congress did an investigation into the State Department under the Reagan administration and the CIA, and found all of these documents revealing the CIA operations, and they admitted to falsely accusing the Nicaraguan government of chemical weapons. So I mean, there's even a historical precedent for that specifically. It's pretty incredible.
And absolutely, and the last point that I wanted to make before I stop for now is the fact that, and again, I told Aaron, when the dirty war began, when the unrest began in Syria, the Arab League, which always wanted to undermine Syria, I mean the Saudis and other countries, they set up an observer mission, a 300-man team, to go to Syria and to observe what's going on. So this was, and the person who led the team was a Sudanese general who was the former ambassador to Doha, Qatar. So this was not a pro-Syrian operation. The Syrians let them into the country, and they filed a report. And if you recall back then, when the Syrians were saying that there's a third force that's shooting both at the protesters and the police and government forces, they were widely ridiculed by the Western media and regional pro-Western media. And then in this report, when they filed the report, they criticized the Syrian government, but they also pointed out that there is a third force. Now, if you try to find this report online, it will be very difficult, and I found it with great difficulty. And I think it's an important report because this is an important historical document. So from early on in Syria, when there were protests in the streets and people were being killed, and the Syrian government was saying there is a third force shooting at both sides, and everyone was ridiculing the Syrian government, this Arab League mission, which was by no means sympathetic to the Syrian government, acknowledged what the Syrian government was saying. And this was very early on in Syria. And so when they made this statement, this organization was disbanded, this body, this mission, and no one talked about it. It sort of like disappeared from the history books.
And the report is hard to find online. It took a while to look for it and to find. There's only like a couple of sites now that still host it. A lot of other places, it's no longer there.
That's
Max,
right.
Do you want to jump in here?
Well, yeah, I actually referred in my book to an appearance that Bashar Jafari, the Syrian UN representative, made on Anderson Cooper on CNN. I think it was 2012. It may have been 2011. And Jafari started to explain that there were indeed foreign-backed jihadist forces that were killing lots of civilians and attacking the army inside Syria, and that this was a militarized conflict, not just some cat-petting dictator mowing down civilians because he liked to do so, and that they were just like holding picket signs and being shot down. And Anderson Cooper just mocked him and said, "What are you talking about, sir? What are you saying? You're saying there are jihadists? Like what?" It was like he was incredulous, and everything has been proven since then. You know, obviously, I didn't get the message early enough either. It was like, you know, a complete blackout in U.S. and Western media on what was actually taking place, unless you went and looked for it and really read between the lines. And then once I understood what was taking place, it clicked for me, because I understood the Nicaraguan example, the Central American example, what took place in El Salvador as well. Contras. This was nothing but a Contra operation on a much larger scale, and also very similar to Operation Cyclone, which is where my book, The Management of Savagery, begins. So I got to go to Syria for the first time in 2019. Anya Parampil, my very close colleague, and Rania Khalek were also there. And we went to many of the same places. Aaron we didn't get to go to Yarmouk, the Palestinian refugee camp that was destroyed, and Aaron can talk about that. But we got to see what it was like in and around the Damascus region, which includes several other towns and rural areas. And it is infuriating, as Aaron said. You do get the sense of an entire population under attack from the outside. It's very clear what's taking place. But I'll just kind of reference 2 points. First was I came in for the wave of ritual attacks that Aaron also received for daring to go into Syrian government territory, which is basically almost all of Syria now, except for Idlib, which is like a human warehouse for refugees run by Al-Qaeda under Turkish management. And then the northeast of Syria, which is, you know, the US and its Kurdish Contras taking over oil wells and wheat fields to keep Syria poor. But the rest of Syria is just Syria. And Damascus is sort of the cultural, political, economic heart of it, along with Aleppo, which I didn't get to visit. And so I came in for all these attacks. There were mainstream correspondents attacking me. They were having, like, Clarissa Ward had a complete meltdown. I mean, she's like the ultimate State Department stenographer. She said that she was like having a seizure because I was there. There was an entire operation to attack me and my delegation. I wasn't, you know, the government didn't provide me with any, like, they didn't fly me there. They didn't coordinate anything except my visa, which is like not as hard as you think to obtain. But I was accused of having government minders, and this was like a big attack that the government was just showing me what they wanted me to see, as though there would be something I could see that would have changed my mind. But that wasn't the case, actually. What struck me was how open the area was to me, that I didn't have government minders. I went to a labor conference for the one main government labor union was holding, with many international representatives of a international socialist labor body. And so, yeah, there were that was a government scene. But once that was over, after like 48 hours, I was just me and Anya and Rania. We were on our own, hanging out with whoever we wanted to hang out with. And we ran into a mutual friend named Naji, who is a Syrian American businessman who had been there at the beginning of the so-called uprising and actually had supported the protests. He even helped support the protests financially. And he said that he was running a factory in a Palestinian refugee camp that was employing many Palestinians. It was like a really good business model because it was helping them, you know, climb out of poverty. He had a very good relationship with everyone in the local community. And that area was seized by some of these Salafi foreign-backed rebels. And he went down to his factory and they basically detained him and forced him to say the Shahada to prove that he was not an Alawite, in which case they would have executed him. And it was in that situation when he decided that, you know, this was not something worth supporting anymore. This was not about reform. This was not about having a better government. It was about destroying the entire state and turning Syria into Libya. So he's pretty far from an Assadist. He's definitely not what you would call a loyalist, but this is someone who, you know, would have been inclined to be against the government. And he, like so many Syrians from so many sectors, poor, rich, middle, whatever's left of the middle class, they banded together just to keep the state from collapsing. And so he was like our friend, and in many cases our guide in a lot of situations, pretty far from a government minder. And he actually went on one of these Facebook threads attacking us and said that he didn't see us with any government minders. We were staying in the old city. He was just hanging out with us. And like, no one would have even acknowledged that. It didn't even matter that he came out and said that. They still wanted to keep this narrative going against us. And yes, we stayed in the old city. Aaron, you can talk about that in a second. This is sort of a microcosm for what so many Syrians experience, because you're in this, as Aaron said in a video, historically precious area where John the Baptist walked. There are churches dating back centuries. You have the tomb of Saladin there. There are so many amazing relics from the Ottoman era. And you have a Christian population living there. And then you walk a few blocks away, and there is a Shia corridor with historic shrines that are holy to people of the Shia sect. And then you go across a highway, which is right outside the old city, and you're in Ghouta, which was ruled by the Saudi-backed Jaish al-Islam, the Army of Islam, put together with Prince Bandar bin Sultan's old weapons, straw buyers from Eastern Europe, and his CIA contacts that he initially used to help fund and supply, guess who? The Contras in Nicaragua. And they had taken over this area, placed it under harsh theocratic rule. The whole area was completely destroyed because the Syrian military was using Vietnam-era weapons to extricate them. And I got to walk in there for an afternoon. I walked in there, and obviously you're not supposed to go in there, especially if you're me. If there is any Syrian government oversight over me, it's to prevent anything from happening to an American citizen, because that would be a disaster for them. But I spoke to some just regular people, a sandwich salesman, and they told me what it was like living under Jaish al-Islam, how people were literally forced into slave labor to dig tunnels, how women were taken from their homes and used as essentially sex slaves or trafficked, how during the final days before their surrender, they took large numbers of civilians and placed them in warehouses and large buildings and used them as basically human shields and said, you know, if you come here and bomb, you will kill all these civilians. They're basically, using them as ransom. Just this wholesale abuse of the civilian population, the theft of aid, all the aid that came in was basically stolen, and then it was used to bribe the civilian population into submission. And this guy said that some people initially supported them who had been influenced by Salafi Islam and been watching the Saudi satellite channels, but then they realized that this is a nightmare. And he referred to their removal as liberation. Those were the terms that this guy Shadi, who I met, used. And then you go back to the old city. If Jaish al-Islam had advanced across the highway, this was the furthest point they reached, the old city would have been absolutely destroyed, as Aleppo's old city was largely destroyed. And the Christian population and the Shia population would have been ethnically cleansed. And so that's a perfect microcosm for what all of Syria experienced. And I really just saw it right there. Aaron, I assume you saw pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, in the old city, I have a friend who lives there, and she showed me, she had a bunker in her house that happened to have been there already. And so she was one of the few people, she says, in her neighborhood who didn't leave, because for a long time, the insurgents who were controlling Ghouta nearby were shelling the old city hundreds of times per day, over 100 times per day. And so she said that for a long period, she lived down in that bunker along with other people, other friends of hers in the neighborhood. And so they didn't leave because they could live underground and not be at risk of getting killed. And a block away was the St. Mary's Cathedral, which dates back to the 1st century. And one of the people who worked there showed me the roof, which said took 3 mortar hits. And he said he stopped counting how many mortars fell right outside the church. And that's who the Syrian government was fighting. A foreign armed, foreign organized insurgent force with jihadis from all around the world who are bent on destroying this beautiful civilization. And that's who the Western public was duped into supporting. And, I forgot to mention before when I was talking about the US dictatorship in Syria. I mentioned the dirty war of 10 years and the murderous sanctions now that prevent it from rebuilding and prevent it from importing medicine. I forgot something. There's also the US occupying 1/3 of Syria. In Trump's words, saying that we're there to take Syria's oil, making this dictatorial colonial attitude towards Syria completely plain. It's like laid out in black and white. But yet our media system is so internalized our self-declared right to colonize and rule over countries thousands of miles away that this is never questioned. How many times does the media talk about how our military is controlling 1/3 of Syria? And just to illustrate how entrenched this is in the US system, it's not just Trump who says this. And Ben, I'm hoping we can play that clip of Dana Stuhl, who now is an official in the Biden administration, works at the Pentagon. And back when she headed the congressionally
She looks like someone I would have went to UPenn with.
Yeah, totally. She said the exact same thing as Trump, that we own 1/3 of Syria, and owning 1/3 of Syria, controlling its breadbasket, where its wheat is, where its oil is, and also holding a card, she said, on reconstruction, gives the US leverage to dictate its own terms, a political outcome in Syria. There's no more authoritarian mindset than one that says we have the right to dictate what another country does, how its government is, whether or not it can access its own food. But yet all of this passes just as normal. And again, it speaks to my point where it's like, we can talk about Syria's internal system all day, but I'm more concerned with the system that I can influence and that currently is inflicting misery on the Syrian people. And let's just hear Dana Stuhl.
Aaron, before you play that, I just wanted to inform you, just a news update. The Senate parliamentarian says that you can't influence your own system. So, okay.
Yeah.
Let's go to the videotape.
All right. And I want to emphasize that she said this before she was in the Biden administration, but Dana Stuhl is now, she's no longer just like a think tanker, a neoconservative think tanker in DC who oversaw Syria policy, which was she was when she made these comments. She's now the head of the Pentagon desk for the Middle East policy in the Biden administration. So this is one of the top Middle East officials for the Biden administration speaking right here.
And there's no volume.
Okay, 1 second. I'll do this again here. I figured out recently what the issue is. So one more time. So again, I just want to stress, this is Biden, one of Biden's top Middle East officials.
The United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified 4. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria Study Group's report, and then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict.
Leverage.
There were 3 other areas of leverage. One is political and diplomatic isolation of the Assad regime, so holding the line on diplomatic isolation, preventing embassies from going back into Damascus. Two is the economic sanctions architecture. So some of this is part of the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration on Iran, but there's a whole suite of both executive and congressional sanctions on Syria and Bashar al-Assad, both for human rights abuses in Syria and to the backers of Assad for their activities in support of him in Syria. And three was reconstruction aid. So the United States remains the overall largest single donor of humanitarian aid to Syrians both inside Syria and refugees outside of Syria. And there was some stabilization assistance.
That's always the excuse
in
they
the
use.
part of Syria that was liberated from ISIS and controlled via the Syrian Democratic Forces in northern eastern Syria. The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction.
To build.
And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argued that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
I mean, I just want to stress this point. The only reason I found that video is because I'm just a psycho and I will go through and watch these ghouls, these goblins at think tanks like CSIS. She was speaking at CSIS, which is like one of the main neoconservative US government funded, arms industry funded think tanks. And I was just like watching these panels, listening to what these psychos say to each other, because the only people who watch those events are other apparatchiks and war criminals in the
Bad
military-industrial
psychos,
complex.
not good psychos like you, but bad psychos watch.
Yeah. Let me distinguish them. So, I mean, that was before she entered the Biden administration. I posted that in 2019. So now she's overseeing at the Pentagon the Middle East desk.
And of course, as Professor Marandi says, who really suffers from this policy? The people of Syria. Syrian government officials are doing fine. They're doing totally fine. The people are suffering, and they're suffering for a reason, as Professor Marandi laid out. The strategy is always, if you can't overthrow a government by force, squeeze the population until they give up on their government, like what happened in Nicaragua. So that's the sadism that is guiding U.S. policy right now. And for people watching the gray zone and maybe not familiar with us and wondering why we always focus on U.S. policy, that's why. It's because people inside Washington openly admit that they are the dictators over Syria and are willing to use Syria's food reserves, its oil, and willing to use the U.S. military to impose its will on a country that has done nothing to us. That's the sick mentality that we're trying to expose and just trying to document. And it's funny that just for the crime of documenting that and talking about it, we get accused of being, paid by Russia and all this stuff like that. It's a reflection of how sick our media is right now, including our leftist media. And look, I have to say, as Professor Marandi said, I definitely witnessed a huge base of support for Assad. That's undeniable. And a lot of it was when I spoke to people, he liberated their towns from the extremist fanatics like Jaish al-Islam. So of course you're going to celebrate the government that freed you from the rule of these people, that executed people for being gay and all the other horror stories that you hear, forcing people to dig tunnels, torture, all this stuff. Of course there's going to be joy about that. And of course, a country that is proud, has a rich civilization, a much richer history than the United States, historically. Of course, they're going to be proud and have pride in their government, and they're going to be resilient in the face of a foreign effort to collapse their state. As I said before, not to say that the Syrian government hasn't committed abuses against its people. Of course it has. But comparatively to the rest of the region, is it any worse? And actually on the key standards of living, healthcare, food production, education, all that stuff. If you look at the UN, the UNICEF, the World Health Organization, all of them ranked Syria as among the best in the region. And this is what the US and its allies helped destroy. And it's just, if you look at discussion now, it's incredible that the sanctions can't get discussed. Even the dirty war can't get discussed. There was a piece in the Washington Post the other day, and it talked about how the elections in Syria signify that 10 years of diplomacy by the US have failed. That's their summary of what the US has done for the last 10 years. 10 years of diplomacy, not dirty wars, like arming and funneling weapons to sectarian death squads and now imposing sanctions that prevent the country from rebuilding. So if we care about authoritarianism, if we care about state propaganda, Let's start with ours.
Yes, and if I may add to this, that one of the things that offends me as an individual is the whole chemical weapons issue, and how, you know, people in Washington and these reporters in Turkey and Europe and the United States shed crocodile tears for the victims. First of all, as Aaron and the rest of you have well documented, the whole Ghouta incident was a false flag operation, and no one can provide a counter argument. And if you point out the evidence of what happened in Ghouta, they just get angry and slander you. But for me, what I find offensive is that these very same people who shed crocodile tears during the 1980s, when Saddam Hussein was given chemical weapons, and he was using them regularly, extensively, incomparable to anything that they alleged to happen in Syria. He killed tens of thousands of his own people and Iranians through chemical weapons. I went to Halepce soon after the attack, where I think 6,000, 6,500, I don't know the exact number, people were killed, innocent people of that town, by Saddam Hussein. Those weapons were given by Western governments. The military intelligence to use those weapons were given by Western governments. And the political cover to get away with using those chemical weapons for years, on a regular basis, on a daily basis. Airplanes would, I survived 2 chemical attacks. Airplanes bombed us. Shells were fired at us, artillery shells, regularly. Tens of thousands of shells, I would assume, during the years. UN officials or delegations would come. Saddam was never condemned. Where are these people who gave Saddam these weapons? And they're alive as we speak today. Some of them are still in government. If these people are so concerned about chemical weapons, then why don't they go and reveal and expose these people and demand them to be put on trial? As we speak, people in Iran are dying. As we speak now, people in Iran continue to die from chemical weapons. So where are their crocodile tears? These people who are so concerned about Syrians in Ghouta, who were under the authority of Jaish al-Islam, as was described earlier, this extremist, crazed group. So they're willing to believe Jaish al-Islam, or elsewhere. You know, when you go to Syria, you're accused of being an Assadist, whatever that means. But Western and American reporters can go to Idlib and meet the head of Al-Qaeda in Idlib. Although, you know, Jabhat al-Nusra officially broke away from Al-Qaeda, and the breaking away from Al-Qaeda was interesting. The representative of Al-Qaeda was sitting beside him saying, yes, he's, you know, Jabhat al-Nusra is now separate from us, sort of trying to help him get this done, to help their image and to build a relationship with Western countries. So Western reporters, PBS reporters, CNN reporters can go to Idlib and meet, and they're not Al-Qaeda affiliated reporters. They're all fine. It's okay to go to Al-Qaeda held territory. But if you go to Syria, where you could get kidnapped, Max, pointed this out. You could get kidnapped and killed as a foreigner, or you can get kidnapped and be held for ransom. Those of us who do go to Syria, go there knowing that it's dangerous for us. But we go there because when we defend Syria and the Syrian people, we feel obliged to go there to say, look, I saw with my own eyes. So I think I've been there 11 or 12 times since 2013 because I feel I have to go. But it's not as if it's, there's no risk involved. So for that person who goes, that PBS reporter who goes into Idlib, I'm sure it's a lot safer for him than it is for Aaron or Max or me or anyone else to go to Damascus. And I've never had a minder or anything like that. But of course, I'm considered to be the minder of minders. One of the things that really bothers me is that I've two of my close friends, Flint and Hillary Leverett, in 2009, when there were accusations that there was cheating in the Iranian election, there was fraud in the Iranian election, which there wasn't. There was no evidence of it. And I was neither a supporter, I wasn't a supporter of either camp, but there just wasn't that evidence. And Flint and Hillary were supporting Iran and, you know, trying to convince the American government to calm down and to you know, move towards some sort of rapprochement with Iran. And they were providing evidence in their articles and on their website of why, you know, that the Western narrative and the American narrative on Iran was false. And they were slandered, and they were even accused of being like, I don't know, I was like their minder or their, I don't know what it's called, but like I'm some sort of intelligence officer, and they're like, they work for me. Such outrageous accusations can be made if someone says anything positive about Iran or Syria or anyone else. And another thing which I find very disturbing is that when it comes to Saddam Hussein, many on the left in the United States would be completely opposed to any American strike on the country, even though he used chemical weapons extensively, even though that was the worst type of police state that you can envisage. You cannot compare Syria to Saddam Hussein. There is just no comparison. But these people, many of those who were opposed to any war with Saddam and who opposed the sanctions on Iraq, they support attack strikes on Syria. They support they support sanctioning ordinary women and children in Syria. Ordinary people who can't survive, who die because they can't pay for the medicine that they need. People right now, as we speak, if you get cancer in Syria, you die. You can't afford to go and get that expensive medicine. You can't. If the hospital doesn't even have the machines are all broken down. They don't have money to buy the spare parts, unless it's a few private hospitals for the more wealthy. But ordinary people in Syria are suffering, and they're suffering because the Americans and the EU are targeting them intentionally. Just as when they provide the Saudis with weapons and they provide them with advisors for their air force, especially the British. The British government is extraordinary. The Canadians, I mean, I apologize to Aaron, but the Canadian government is just as murderous as any of the other governments of NATO.
No offense taken.
For what they've done. So the double standards is extraordinary. People on the left, somehow, for them, attacking Iraq was horrible, even though Saddam was Saddam Hussein. Yet Syria, if you are anti-war, somehow you're some sort. I prefer, and I say this very openly, I prefer President Assad to that lady who you just showed her clip. I prefer him to her. I prefer him to Obama. Actually, I tweeted this once, and a friend of mine said, "Don't do this. You know, you're going to get into trouble." These people started the dirty war. They supported Al Qaeda in Syria. Senior officials in Israel have said on multiple occasions that we prefer ISIS over Assad. At least if Western reporters are going to be opposed to the Syrian government, and if they want to call the Syrian government murderous and Assad a child killer and a person who gasses his own people and all that sort of nonsense, at least have the decency to say, and we supported ISIS, and we support Al Qaeda today. At least have the decency to say that. When Serena Sheem, she was a reporter for Press TV. She was in 2014. She was reporting on the border between Syria and Turkey. She's a Lebanese. She was a Lebanese American young woman with 2 children. I think she was 39 at the time. She was reporting from the border and pointing out and saying that Turkish intelligence were using World Food Organization trucks that belong to the UN to funnel in weapons and troops for ISIS inside Syria. And then in one of her reports, she said on live TV, on press TV, that I'm worried because Turkish intelligence has accused me of being a spy. She died hours later in an accident. We never figured out what happened to her. No one here believes that it was just an accident.
They said she drove into the back of a truck or something
something really crazy, and they wouldn't give the name of the truck driver. And then none of the American reporters, these reporters based in Istanbul, she was a fellow American. No one said anything. The Western media said nothing. It was because because she's on the wrong side. So she died. She was saying that UN trucks were being used by ISIS, and Turkish intelligence was working with ISIS. And we could talk about what the relationship between ISIS and Western countries and Turkey and governments in the Persian Gulf and so on for hours. I know you're all you know this better than I. The extensive oil trade that was taking place between ISIS and Turkey as U.S. jets were flying overhead and doing nothing. It was only when the Russian Air Force came in and started bombing these tankers that ISIS began losing a lot of money, and of course the Turkish government. So
there's that clip of John Kerry. There's that clip of John Kerry admitting saying we sat back and watched as ISIS was encroaching on Damascus.
Yes, because they wanted to use ISIS to force Assad to negotiate. So, how can these people accuse anyone of being a mercenary of Syria? I mean, Syria is so poor. What could the Syrian government offer to anyone that to make them like a mercenary for the Syrian government? But so you are slandered if you go to an impoverished country like Syria to tell the story of the Syrian people, yet you are allowed to go into Al-Qaeda territory, we all know that ISIS was Al-Qaeda. They split over their own political divisions. ISIS was Al-Qaeda. It was Al-Qaeda, and then when Abu Bakr Baghdadi declared the Islamic State, then Jolani, they didn't accept to go under his authority, and they split, and they had their own conflict, which was a good thing, because if that infighting hadn't taken place, they would have been much stronger. They would have taken Iraq. So, and then when ISIS goes into Iraq, what does the United States do? Nothing. They allow ISIS to advance on on Baghdad, the same thing, for the same reason, to put pressure on Maliki, because they didn't like Maliki. So they allowed ISIS to advance. So evil Iran goes into Iraq, General Soleimani fights ISIS, helps create the Iraqi forces to fight back. He saves Erbil, the Kurdish city, even though the head of the Kurdish government of Iraq in northern Iraq was not friendly, but he rescued the city. And then the United States goes and murders this hero who basically saved the region from ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Without him and without his troops, we would be living in a very different world today. And those very same leaders, people like Erdogan, I have no doubt they would have regretted what they have done, because ISIS would not stick within their own borders. They had huge ambitions.
They would have definitely overrun parts of Lebanon as well.
Oh, yes, they would have taken Lebanon.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that point. In the context of the Syrian election, yeah, it wasn't Democrat against Republican or, two parties really. There wasn't a strong opposition candidate who had a chance of winning. But many of the people who did go and cast their votes for Assad were making a statement against sort of the de facto opposition candidate, who was Mohammed Jolani, who is the ruler of Idlib, basically. They call it the Syrian Salvation Government. It's essentially rebranded Al-Qaeda. And the way that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the faction that comprises rebranded Al-Qaeda and provides the sort of security apparatus and the ideological foundation for the Syrian Salvation Government in Idlib behaves is, I think, how Ayman al-Zawahiri, the de facto leader of Al-Qaeda, the successor of Osama bin Laden, who is always, the real guide. I think that they're behaving the way he would want them to.
Do you have the picture where he's wearing a suit with a reporter from?
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about that with Martin Smith from PBS.
Yeah.
So basically, Mohammed Jolani, he's the guy who went into Syria with a little team of Al-Qaeda to first take Raqqa, and they provided an opening for Baghdadi to declare the caliphate. Then they had the split over money. They were fighting over money, so Al-Qaeda became Jabhat al-Nusra, and they had maybe some different strategy. Nusra wanted to win over the opposition and focus on Assad, whereas Baghdadi wanted to just establish his caliphate. However, there were many battles where the Islamic State actually fought alongside quote unquote free Syrian army groups that the U.S. was directly funding. I wrote about that in my book. But the point is that Jolani was the leader of Al-Qaeda's murderous, hyper-sectarian faction in Syria, which subjected civilian populations to so much misery and wanted to commit genocide against minority groups inside Syria. They took over Idlib thanks to a lot of TOW missiles, anti-tank guided missiles that were shipped in through Turkey, through the Incirlik air base, that were provided through the FSA, which became a basically weapons farm for Nusra. And, a lot of it was paid for by, private Saudi donors and Gulf donors, but it was thanks to the U.S. This is what.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
That they had so many anti-tank missiles that they were not using them against tanks. They're using them against individual soldiers.
Yeah, there's video of them. There is video of them targeting just like 2 or 3 soldiers with wire-guided missiles, just to show the plethora of supply they had.
Yeah, and I just want to point out really quickly, I wrote an article for the Gray Zone it was 2017, and this is back when we were still at Alternates as the Gray Zone Project, and I looked through, this is before YouTube purged all of the opposition propaganda channels that were run by these HTS and these fake Al-Qaeda, or these Al-Qaeda spin-off groups with other fake names, and they posted videos on their own YouTube accounts showing them using anti-tank missiles that are clearly made by Lockheed Martin, by Raytheon, by these U.S. companies. And before YouTube removed all of those YouTube channels, you could easily go through those channels and just find so many examples of Al-Qaeda fighters in Syria using U.S. and also Turkish weapons.
And you could see all the crazy shit that their, field preacher who came over from Saudi Arabia, Muhaisini, was saying. I mean, it was just utterly bonkers. And these are the people that the U.S. was sort of indirectly backing, but they knew that they were the leaders of the opposition. And so just to kind of pick up where I left off, Idlib is taken in 2015. And then refugees from the areas that, including fighters, are taken out. The fighters from East Aleppo, when East Aleppo was liberated, who are affiliated with Nusra and the other Turkish-backed factions, they were sent on green buses to Idlib. Idlib has its own refugee population. And basically you have a human warehouse in Idlib for everyone who either fought against the Syrian government and their families, who are ideologically supportive of the kind of Nusra theocratic Islamic State idea, or just its own local population, Sunnis who don't like Assad, people who the West and NATO do not want to return to Syria. They want to use them as a card. And so you have millions of refugees under the control of Al-Qaeda, which rebrands. Turkey comes in, starts providing them with guidance, even, teaching materials to make them pro-Turkish, pro-Erdogan, even pro-Ottoman. Some of the teaching material is very Islamist in nature and sectarian. They're providing them with military support. They ultimately defend Idlib against the Syrian and Russian advance, prevent them from taking it. Why? Well, besides the fact that this is a Turkish and therefore NATO card, there's also those refugees. And Turkey does not want to take on another refugee wave. And if Turkey takes them on, we've seen what Erdogan has done before. When Germany or the EU pisses him off, he lets refugees go, and he lets them go west. And so Europe doesn't want to take this on either. So there's one guy there, Jolani, who has the refugee card, not only who has the refugee card against Erdogan and Europe. And so the International Crisis Group, whose former director, Robert Malley, is now Iran envoy for the Obama administration, something I want to get into in a minute with Mohammed. But just highlighting how connected this group is to the Democratic Foreign Policy Establishment, this NGO. They issue a report basically puffing Jolani as someone who has become sane, who's put on a suit and decided to get serious about governing. And while there's been torture in his prisons and he's done a few bad things here and there, he is the least bad option. And that becomes sort of the brand for Jolani, the least bad option, because they don't want to take on these refugees. And, if they give up Idlib also, then Syria, it opens up all of these highways and areas between Damascus and Aleppo, and Syria's economy will start to improve. So they don't want to allow that to happen either. And so Martin Smith comes in along with, it's not just him, Ben Hubbard from the New York Times. They've all gone into Idlib. They meet with their press office, which is like kind of being managed behind the scenes, I think, by Turkey. But they basically have their own press office now. Ben Hubbard was like photographed taking pictures with rebranded Al-Qaeda's press officer, getting his credentials. Like if I had done that with Assad's people, I would have been fried online, but nothing happened with him. And so Martin Smith does this giant special for PBS called The Jihadist, where Jolani's seated across from him in a three-piece suit. This guy who previously had only appeared in combat fatigues before, he's trying to seem rational. And he takes Martin Smith around Idlib city in a car.
Trimmed his beard too.
What's that?
He trimmed his beard too, I think.
Yeah, he trimmed his beard down. He looks like, one of the Muslim Brotherhood technocrats from Egypt now. Before he had the real thing. Like a lot of those Salafi guys, when they're in the field, they wear like their beard really long and they have long hair, and like it's sort of a style you'll see with a lot of the Salafi factions that were backed by Turkey in Syria. Anyway, yeah, and then he shows that he's a man of the people. He drives around in the city with just Martin Smith and his camera crew. He gets out and shakes people's hands, tries to convey the sense that he has popular support. This was all filmed in March, and actually days after it was filmed, there was a public execution in the middle of Idlib, I think, of a woman who was accused of committing adultery, which has been going on for a while there. But that wasn't shown.
Which, by the way, Ben Hubbard does not mention in his reports on Idlib. Yeah. When he buries a mention of Al-Qaeda's crackdowns on people, and his only example is that an organization for women was shut down. He doesn't mention people being executed for the crime of adultery.
Yeah, that's.
I also want to point out that there used to be video online that was all over the place showing Nusra executing women in the center plaza of Idlib, the capital of Idlib city. but that was taken down by all of like the big platforms.
Well,
It
you
used
can
to be
see,
even on like archive.org, and it was taken down there as well because they say that it's extremist propaganda, which I mean maybe you could say it is if it's I don't know why these propagandists would use that as propaganda, but like there were videos circulating showing these people executing women in broad daylight in the center of the city.
well, we have that scene. That scene can be seen in short documentary that's on our channel at the Gray Zone called The Syria Deception by Dan Cohen. And you have to prove you're of age, and there's an extreme content warning. So the video's been soft censored.
You have to give your social security number and credit card number to
Yeah,
access
pretty
it.
much biometric scans and everything. But so
but
basically, yeah, just
yes.
to kind of wrap up, I watched this. I really think everyone should watch it just to see how insidious it is, because it's not an overt commercial for Jolani, but it features Western officials like James Jeffrey, who was the Syria liaison for the Trump and Obama administrations. He comes out of WINEP, Washington Institute, same think tank that Dana Stroul, who we heard before, talking about the U.S. basically owning 1/3 of Syria, was a part of, pro-Israel think tank in Washington, and Andrew Tabler, also from the Washington Institute. And the Washington Institute has a special Turkey program. These figures have had a long-standing positive relationship with Turkey. Turkey is portrayed as this kind of rational force that has prevented a massive refugee wave. And Jolani, while they don't praise him, although Jeffrey does refer to him as having been an asset in passing, they keep saying that the phrase, the least bad option. He's the least bad option. And that's the impression that this PBS special leaves you with. Martin Smith is not the worst reporter. He actually did a pretty good 2015 special inside Assad, Syria, which showed what is actually happening there in a fairly non-propagandistic way. But you can't leave, if you don't know a lot about Syria, you can't watch this and not think, this guy wears a suit, he's all they've got, and Assad is worse. And actually, we have a piece coming out that Ben did that actually has Martin Smith under pressure from an interviewer, Scott Horton, who's a libertarian anti-war podcast host, anti-war radio. His interviews are excellent. And he interviews Smith and says, how could you not focus more on the foreign support for Jolani? How do you did you highlight the fact that they, massacred minorities, that they wanted to carry out genocide against them, that there were executions of women in the town square, that what a monstrous force they were? And at the end, Smith says, well, they might be bad, but actually Assad killed more people. So he kind of shows his hand there. And this is what's happening on public television in the US. The longtime leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria is being presented as to the Western public, but especially to Western foreign policy elites, which is his real constituency, as someone who should lead one of the 3 areas of Syria. Basically, it's like his own election campaign being carried out in parallel to Assad's. And I think we should look at that. We should look at the Syrian election in the context of this parallel, disgusting campaign being run in Idlib.
So the United States invades Afghanistan because of Al-Qaeda. Then they lie to their own public, and the British lie to their own public in order to be able to invade Iraq. They destroy Iraq. It's still a mess. And then they go and support Al-Qaeda in Syria. So how it can't get more immoral than this. Those who say, Assadists.
Well, sorry to interrupt, but how did bin Laden get out of Tora Bora? It was through the very mountain passes and tunnels that the bin Laden company had built for the CIA when the CIA was supporting the Mujahideen. He knew how to get out because his company, they have earth-moving systems. They helped reconstruct Mecca, and he brought them in with CIA money. So that's how he got out. That's how Al-Qaeda got out.
Absolutely. So the whole creation of Al-Qaeda is, it's an American Saudi project, and But the point is that let's that aside, just in the last few years, the Americans invaded Iraq in the name of Al Qaeda. Whereas Saddam had no relationship with the organization, obviously. And then now we see people from CNN going into Idlib. We see the United States allowing Al Qaeda to thrive, to supporting Al Qaeda. It's just if one reason why when some people they believe when they believe, I don't want to push this too far because I'm afraid certain people will misunderstand me. When people don't believe anything that comes from the West, it's because of this behavior. So let's say there was a crime committed somewhere in the world no one is going to believe it because it's this is what the Americans have done this year.
You're saying it's why many people in the Middle East don't believe the official account of 9/11. I mean,
not only 9/11, the Holocaust, anything, because when they look at the United States, they see that this government is lying about everything. So even if there is some crime committed, which is a European crime, let's say the Holocaust, it has nothing to do with Palestinians. Or when there is a crime carried out in the United States by those very forces that, as you rightly pointed out, were trained and funded by the US and its allies. When some people say, well, and I know people will attack me now, I know some people will criticize me now for saying 9/11 was carried out by Al Qaeda. But when they don't believe it, yeah, I know it's but I understand why.
It's a safe space
because
it's a safe space for that here. It's okay.
Yeah, but I understand why, because the United States is so dishonest at all levels, the media, think tanks. I mean, as you rightly pointed out, senior officials in the US government are trying to normalize Al Qaeda. Government media or media close to the government is trying to normalize Al Qaeda. So when you see that sort of thing, people, our memories aren't that short. I mean, people remember this. So when they see this sort of behavior, no one believes anything that comes. I mean, most people don't believe anything that comes from Western countries. So on the one hand, you see these, the destruction of this region. If you look from across the region, everywhere you look, the United States is involved. Either they're supporting Al Qaeda and they're working with the Saudis in Afghanistan, not just to destroy the Soviet Union's army, to harm the Soviet Union and to destroy the Soviet Union, but actually, as it later turned out, to lure in the Soviet Union into Afghanistan. The Carter administration actually was trying to bring in the Soviet Union to create their Vietnam, to undermine the country. So they sacrificed a country, a nation, millions of people, and created extremism. And the extremist textbooks that they were used were being published, I think, in Oklahoma University. They were printed in an American university and then sent back.
It was the University of Nebraska through their
Their
Afghan studies program was set up entirely by the CIA, and its director actually took Taliban leadership. I mean, I can't believe this hasn't. Well, I can believe, but it should be in some movie. He actually took Taliban leadership prior to 9/11. I believe it was 1999. He took them on a trip to Mount Rushmore. So this is, what has been going on, not just during the Cold War, but even after. There was a close relationship between Washington and the Taliban during the 1990s. And part of it passed through this CIA hub at the University of Nebraska.
Extraordinary stuff.
I want to talk, Mohammed, also about what just took place in Gaza. It's very significant for the region, and what's happening in Vienna. But first, Aaron, I I don't know if you were implicitly attacked by the United States delegation at the UN over the OPCW report, but there have been some recent and Thomas Phipps, Mr. Phipps, he's a very hyperactive, his thumbs are very hyperactive. He's a British diplomat who said that I'm like a Russian asset and that you are, and that, he's always attacking. You made him very nervous. He got upset because I said 100 years ago he'd be wearing a pith helmet and hyperventilating about the Bolsheviks releasing the details of Sykes-Picot and calling it disinformation. But it seems like you're really getting under their skin. You're being implicitly attacked by high-level diplomats. What's happening with the OPCW report or the OPCW? They just released another report that 17 incidents. It seems like the whole organization is under the control of the U.S. now. And I don't know if going to Duma, you got to go to Duma. I don't know if that shed any light on what you've been writing about.
I did go to Duma. I saw the hospital where the White Helmets staged that scene, where in parallel with the video of the dead bodies filmed inside location 2, as it's referred, the location where the bodies were filmed, there was a video put out of a hospital scene where the White Helmets basically staged a fake scene. They ran in screaming chemical attack, and they had cameras. They started filming. But one of the boys in the video testified that he was not subjected to any chemical attack. And the head of the hospital said that basically the White Helmet staged it. He told that to Robert Fisk, the late Robert Fisk. So I went to that hospital, and I also saw underneath the hospital was the most sophisticated tunnel system I've ever seen. These like well-reinforced tunnels, huge, that you could drive vehicles through. You could drive military vehicles through. And that's what Jaish al-Islam did around Duma, moving supplies. And this hospital was a part of their network. And I like to talk about this because it ties into Palestine. The expertise of Hamas was used for that. There were some people in Hamas who actually assisted with that. I know that Hamas was split over it, but I think it's worth discussing because it's a part of the story. And I'd love to hear Professor Marandi's thoughts on it. But and then I also went inside the town of Duma, and I spoke to a couple of residents and about what it was like to live under Jaish al-Islam. And they described it exactly as, we always hear about. It was horrible. They murdered people for things like adultery. They were ruthless. They forced people to dig tunnels. And those people who staged this Duma deception are the people who these so-called diplomats in Washington and London are now protecting, because the evidence that everyone can see is overwhelming that this Duma thing was staged. Even if we didn't have the OPCW leaks, the actual investigators who went to Syria and wrote a report and had it censored and kept from the public, even if we didn't have that, you can make a case just from the open source evidence. And starting with the plausibility of the Syrian government as it's about to retake a town, a battle it's almost won, all of a sudden deploying chemical weapons, thereby doing the one thing that it knows will trigger U.S. military strikes, as Trump had promised and did over another fake allegation the year before. So even without the OPCW leaks, you have a scandal. But with the OPCW leaks, you have a global scandal, because now this top chemical watchdog is being exploited to wage warfare on Syria, to justify the military strikes that followed the Duma deception, to justify the ongoing sanctions. And by the way, it's so extreme that they're not just exploiting the OPCW for that one Duma incident. The OPCW won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2014 because after the alleged Ghouta attack in 2013, Russia brokered a deal where Syria would give up all of its chemical weapons stockpile. And of course, investigative reporting from Seymour Hersh later showed that Ghouta was staged by the insurgents as well, who had gotten sarin from Turkey, that the sarin found in Ghouta did not match the sarin in the Syrian government stockpile. This was confirmed by the British government military lab, that James Clapper went to Barack Obama and said this intelligence is not a slam dunk, a deliberate reference to what George Tenet said about Iraq. So we know that Ghouta was staged as well, but regardless, in response to it, the allegation, Syria went into the Chemical Weapons Convention, which was a huge achievement for the world. But look what happened to it. The OPCW was then used Syria's ascension to continue to wage warfare on it. So we see that with the Duma case where they falsely accuse it of being guilty. And now with, with every single incident, they always release a report that in a sneaky way blames Syria, even if the evidence is completely controlled by the white helmets, as was the case with Sarakib, a recent report where all samples came from the white helmets, which is an organization, a propaganda organization funded by the same belligerents waging war on Syria. And the OPCW, in violation of its own stated policies, is relying on these so-called samples. So we've seen this beautiful achievement for the world and global peace, Syria giving up its chemical weapons arsenal, being used to wage a new way of warfare against Syria. And the Duma deception exposes the lies that have been used to do all this and the deceit. And so what are these governments doing? Well, yesterday at the UN, there was an extraordinary session, which I'll cover soon on Pushback, where Fernando Arias, the OPCW chief, he appeared and he gave his most extensive comments on Duma to date. He attacked the inspectors. He lied about them. He said that Inspector B played a role in the investigation, when in reality, Inspector B wrote the original report and was the mission's chief scientific coordinator. He also said that the other inspector, Ian Henderson, was not even a member of the fact-finding mission. We know from the OPCW's own documents that we published the Gray Zone that that's false. But regardless, all these attacks are done to avoid talking about the actual facts, the real issue, which is the documented scientific fraud that occurred and the refusal by the OPCW to investigate it. So in the process, Arias told some new lies yesterday. He actually stole a talking point from me and put it in reverse. When I spoke at the UN Security Council a few weeks ago or a month ago, I debunked this notion that they put out, which is that after the original inspectors were sidelined, that somehow after that, all of the real sampling and analysis was conducted, that the majority of the work was done. I showed that to be false simply by comparing what's in the original interim report and the final report. And it shows that, for example, 70% of the samples were analyzed by the original team. Just 30% were sampled after they were gone. And if you look at them all individually, they show nothing new of significance that can bring you to a conclusion.
Almost no new work was done in the official report.
Yes, exactly. So Arias took the figure of 70% of being done by the original team, and he appropriated. He said yesterday that he's talked about 70 samples, new samples out of 100 being analyzed after the team was sidelined. So, which is false. So they're actually telling egregious lies, and we'll have more on Pushback soon and more at the Gray Zone. I'll write about it. But that's a state of desperation. And you saw, when he's been given a simple proposal, will you meet with the dissenting inspectors, and will you let the OPCW's own scientific advisory board, not Russia's scientists or China's scientists or South Africa's scientists, but the OPCW's own scientific advisory board, will you let them adjudicate this dispute? Meet with the inspectors and weigh the evidence that was suppressed. And he said that that's out of his hands. He can't do that. That's against the rules. And he also said that he's not going to reopen the Duma case because it's closed. That's what he said. And he's backed up in his denialism by all these Western diplomats who, yes, took shots at me and others and saying that we're all Assad supporters. And that's all that they can do because they are desperate to avoid talking about the facts, which are just so overwhelming and damning.
So, the saga continues. I mean, they're just going to, they didn't expect themselves to be at this point. They didn't expect there to be dissidents emerging from their own ranks. They didn't expect the founding director of the OPCW to be taking their side. They didn't expect international celebrities from Roger Waters to Susan Sarandon and famed journalists like John Pilger to take up this cause. But Aaron is really, I think you've been really providing the platform for all of this to take place. And we have some really good questions for, especially for Mohammed. So I want to get into.
And that's probably one thing. They also didn't expect that the original documents would be preserved, but they were.
Right.
And that's how we
right.
know.
And we've
Matt, just before you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Just a couple of things. First, the first head of the OPCW, why was he removed in the first place? What was that story?
Well, he and his family, Bustani's family, were threatened by John Bolton, who then
what did he say to him?
We know where your kids live. We know where your kids live.
We know where your kids are.
Yeah.
It just does.
And then, by the way, why was he then blocked from testifying at the UN Security Council? Because, by the way, and this is one of the most incredible parts of the story, these inspectors, they're so experienced that their tenure with the OPCW coincides with the OPCW's first Director General, Jose Bustani, who was there at the founding of this organization in 1997. So when he came to the UN Security Council back in the fall to attest to their credibility and speak about how the known fraud in this Duma case violated the OPCW's core principles, what happened to him? The US and their allies blocked him from speaking at the UN Security Council, which is pretty unprecedented. How many times is the former chief of a renowned international body, the one under discussion, prevented from speaking at the UN Security Council? It never happens. I've never heard of such a case before. And the reason it happens is because these people are so afraid of the facts. And they're relying on, by the way, the media having been co-opted to promote dirty war propaganda. They're relying on the media being completely silent. And so far, the US media, including progressive outlets like Democracy Now! And The Intercept, have totally complied. And that's another part of this scandal. It's not just an OPCW scandal, it's a media scandal as well.
Okay, so
before Max asks me these questions, I just want to just make a couple of points. One is that, and then when the Americans carried out those strikes on Syria, they supposedly targeted these chemical weapons. But there, if they had done such a thing, you would have had a catastrophe. You would have had, explosions and contamination all over the place. So it was all fake. They did not strike any chemical weapons. There were no chemical weapons. They were just trying to weaken the Syrian army. And as Aaron pointed out, every time the Syrian government is winning a battle, suddenly these chemical weapons allegations come out. By the way, the lighting here is okay. I don't know why it's on screen. It seems to be going out. And then two things that I want to to point out. One is that with regards to the this is my own experience. I went to West Aleppo right after liberation. I was in Syria when East Aleppo was liberated from ISIS and its affiliates, from Al Qaeda and its affiliates. The White Helmets building, the main building in Aleppo, in East Aleppo, is right beside the White Helmets building, right beside the Jabhat al-Nusra building, right beside, and they had tunnels linking one another. So the White Helmets were totally, completely linked. They were totally under the control of Al Qaeda. And then the second point that I wanted to make is that I was invited by the Syrian foreign ministry, the South Korean foreign ministry for a discussion on the Middle East, on West Asia. And this lady, American officer, came there and she said, I just came from northern Syria. And then she started talking about, how the Syrian Air Force and the Russian Air Force, how they destroyed East Aleppo. And then I said, have you, and then I asked her, have you been to Raqqa? And she said, yes. And I said, what does it look like? She said, it's utterly destroyed. I said, how can you talk about, accuse anyone of anything when you yourself, the destruction that you created in Raqqa is worse? And I added, I was not only in Aleppo when East Aleppo was liberated, I was also in Mosul when it was liberated from ISIS. I went there like a day after. We were the first group to go and see the Nuri Jami Mosque, the mosque where Abu Bakr Baghdadi declared the Islamic State. We went there and I filmed it, and I did an interview a few hours later. The city was huge parts of the city were destroyed by the U.S. Air Force. So when the Americans go and bomb Mosul and destroy homes and neighborhoods and government buildings, it's okay. If they destroy Raqqa, it's okay. But if someone else does it in Aleppo,
in their
then
own country,
suddenly,
in their own country,
in their own country, defending their country against these extremists that they're funding, then suddenly it's a completely different story. Sorry
Yeah.
about
No, that was a really important point, and I think the Chinese government is also making that point now. You're criticizing our counter-terror approach in Xinjiang, where we're not even bombing anyone, and look at what you did in Raqqa. You just literally destroyed half the city. Large number of civilians were just reduced to like piles of dead bodies. It was a massacre, all to extricate the Islamic State, which you played a role in helping to create. So for sure. So we have some very good, well, first of all, Ben has had to go because Ben is in the middle of a giant national political intrigue in Nicaragua. If you want to know what's happening, read his 7,000 word deep dive into USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. Basically, we've been talking about the U.S. Funding and arming insurgent proxies, but here Ben details how the U.S. has basically created political proxies in Nicaragua, basically funded, trained, cultivated, managed the entire anti-Sandinista opposition since President Daniel Ortega was elected in 2006 in his first election. And a new election is going to take place at the end of this year. The opposition candidate, Cristiana Chamorro, from this major political dynasty, right-wing oligarchic dynasty or center-right, basically a neoliberal dynasty, has been put under house arrest. Her foundation, the Chamorro Foundation, has been the main channel for USAID money to the opposition. She controls it substantially. And Nicaragua's government has finally decided we're not going to take it anymore, especially after this violent coup that these elements staged against us, where they terrorized the entire country and made it look similar to Syria in 2011, 2012. We're not going to take it anymore. Ben's piece outlines the whole U.S. role. And, he was gone on Nicaraguan national TV to talk about his reporting, and the Nicaraguan opposition and the U.S. embassy, which puppeteers it, is freaking out right now. So it's a very, it's an amazing situation in Nicaragua. So we had Aaron over in Syria generating this giant meltdown in international media. Now we got Ben in Nicaragua. I don't know what I'm going to do to step up.
Pure evil.
I got to do something to cause, do some evil doing here in Washington. But in the meantime, what I will do is I'm going to read a few super chats. Thank you, Rikesh Kutu, Ben Redward. All the channels who make money by commenting on news gathered by others should be pressured to contribute money to real news gatherers like the Gray Zone. I agree. Much respect for the coverage. Thank you, Asma Mushtaq. We've been to Concordia for special events, and whenever Canada stops locking people down, then we'll come back. What do we got here? We got Cian Board. Thank you so much, Cian, and thanks for all the important work you're doing across the Atlantic. Giordano Franchetti, well done. Let us know some, basically giving us props. Thank you, Gabriel Arcari. Thank you to Ashurbanipal. Huge respect. And, Ashurbanipal wants to say that Assyrians are a living people, and most Aramaic speakers are ethnically Assyrian, regardless of sectarian church propaganda. All three of us, I believe, have got to visit Malula and to actually hear Aramaic prayers in one of the last places on earth where Aramaic is spoken, and this was an area that was defended not only by the Syrian government but also by Hezbollah and the
That's right.
Social National Party, which fought in combined force against Al-Qaeda that had kidnapped nuns there. But I want to get to these questions, although I'm sure we could all talk about that. There are some pretty interesting questions. One of the most interesting ones is the difference between the Russian and Iranian approach in Syria, Mohammed. obviously they partnered together, but when I was in Syria, I was actually hearing complaints from the loyalist population about the Russian role there, that they were trying to play the role of a kind of broker, not only between different groups in Syria, but also were coordinating with Israel, or trying to basically intervene in a way that wasn't necessarily in the national interest of Syria, and that they were trying to edge Hezbollah and the Iranians out. But what are your thoughts on the difference in approach there?
I don't think that the Russians and the Iranians have all that many differences in Syria. I think a lot of it is exaggerated in the Western media. It's sort of the, and in Western think tanks. The Iranians understand that the Russians have a relationship with Israel. The Iranian approach towards Israel is completely different from Russia. Iran sees Israel as an apartheid state, like apartheid South Africa. It sees it as illegitimate. And the Russians see it sort of like how the Europeans and the Americans do. Not the same, but more similar to that. So the Iranians recognize the Russian position. The Russians recognize the Iranian position. I would say that there are some slightly different approaches. One is when the Israelis bomb Syria, and the Israelis don't bomb Iranian soldiers or Hezbollah or these people. If they did, they could provide names of people who were killed, because you can't hide dead soldiers. You could provide, they have accounts, they're known, when they're killed, their pictures come out. If there are any Hezbollah people killed or Iranians, then the Israelis could name them. They just say they strike the Iranians because they want to have an excuse, even though it's not justified, because the Iranians are in Syria at the request of the Syrian government. But they want to have an excuse to bomb Syria. They want to have an excuse to bomb Syrian government positions. They want to keep the Syrian government weak. So they scapegoat Iran, and of course the Western media is silent about this constant aggression. And the Russians haven't been helping Syria in this regard. So the Syrians are not completely happy with the Russians. Another difference, and I don't want to go into great detail here, was some of the military approaches. So the Russians their bombing campaigns were heavy, not dissimilar to that of the United States, as I was pointing out earlier. And the Iranians, in general, thought that some things could have been done differently. The bombing campaigns and the way they were conducted, I think the Iranians were not always in favor of them. But still, the other side is Al Qaeda, it's ISIS, it's Jaish al-Islam, and they're foreign backed. It doesn't change anything. And as I said, when I was arguing with that lady officer, that American officer in Seoul, I was saying, you destroyed Raqqa, you destroyed, you've bombed all of these countries, and you're in no position to complain about how the Russians bombed Aleppo. So I don't think the differences are all that sharp. Right now, Iran has become very popular in Syria, as I've noticed, because of Gaza. And so, that's that I found interesting during my stay in Syria, but that's not completely related. And by the way, I think when I sit back, the lights are okay. When I move forward, I think that may cause a problem.
It's the evil darkness emanating from your soul.
Oh yes, yes, oh yes, absolutely. I've been doing this for a long time. You guys are new at it, so
Well,
after a couple of years, your lights will go out like this too. It's a process.
You're our evil minder, so we're just trying to get there. With just a few quick questions to knock out, and then I have some about, because you brought up Gaza. And one is about food security in Syria. The World Food Program has ruled that majority of Syrians are now, or a substantial number of Syrians are now, food insecure. This is a direct result of the Caesar sanctions. And check out my report on how those Caesar sanctions came about through a gigantic deception and loads of Qatari money. How is the population feel about Assad, the loyalist population under sanctions? I mean, I was told various things and by different people from different political persuasions when I was there. Some said, there was a lot of discontentment. But we also saw what took place with the election where there were huge crowds to celebrate. So obviously, as Aaron pointed out, he still has a substantial base. And what the U.S. is obviously trying to do is deny Syria the victory of winning this war. The question is whether Russia and China will be able to come in. Mohammed, this is, I guess, the last question here from our patrons is, do you know to what extent U.S. sanctions prevents Iran, China, or Russia from assisting in the rebuilding of civilian infrastructure that the U.S. openly, explicitly aims to prevent?
Well, as you pointed out earlier, 1/3 of Syria is owned by the United States, as American officials have put it, and most of Syria's agriculture comes from that area. In addition to that, the Turkish government is not allowing the water to flow into Syria in the amounts that it should under international agreements. So the Syrians, not only are the Americans blocking agricultural goods from one part of Syria going into the areas that they can control, to go into other parts of Syria where most of the population is, but the Turks are also hampering agriculture in general through blocking the flow of water. And of course, most of Syrian fuel, oil, is also, Syria used to export oil, and it would use that oil to subsidize health care and schools and that sort of thing. So that oil, not only can they no longer export it, but they can't use their own oil. Iranian companies, they are involved in Syria, but Iran is itself heavily sanctioned. The United States and the Europeans are targeting ordinary Iranians just as they're targeting Syrians, just as they're targeting Venezuelans and so on. But Russia and China, so far they've been slow because of their concerns about the United States, not just in Syria, but also in Venezuela, in Iran, in Cuba, and elsewhere, because of the threat of sanctions. But things are changing. I do believe things are gradually changing, slowly, but they are changing. But I would like to point out one thing, and that is that in my trips to Syria, when I would go to university, when I would speak to people in Syria are actually more open in their criticism than people in the Emirates. In the Emirates, I wish I did my homework before I came on the show, but if it just until recently, I don't know, it's probably still, the law is still in place. If you say something favorable about Qatar, you can go to jail and you have to pay a fine of like $100,000 or $150,000. I'm not sure about the amount. So if you just say something favorable about another country in the Emirates, so there's no comparison. Or there's another country in the Persian Gulf where there's a poet who just said something critical about the leader, and he was sentenced, I think, to be executed, and then he's in prison for life. I think Aaron knows where I'm talking about because I think we had a discussion about this in Damascus. So in these countries where there are no elections, you see the media talking about how ridiculous the elections in Syria, and the election in Syria was not really an election. I mean, at least there were two other candidates. I mean, you don't have that in Saudi Arabia, and at least you had you didn't have to vote. And when they say, like, I don't know, whatever, 75% turnout, that meant 25% didn't show up, and that means that, so it's not that dangerous, because if everyone's forced to vote, then you should, the 25% should have showed up as well. But the point that I'm trying to make is that this was more of a referendum or a show of confidence to the government that is fighting extremists that's funded by foreign governments. And I don't believe that it was an ordinary presidential election. But there is no doubt that President Assad has an extraordinarily large amount of support, as I was saying earlier on. And
it wasn't as the problem is it wasn't as stable and credible as our vote in the United States presidential election, and that unlike and that they couldn't muster as many people as Biden got for his inauguration, where he got 30,000 National Guard troops surrounding him to protect him against QAnon insider attacks. So clearly we put on a democratic model here.
Oh, absolutely.
We're standing on the moral tower looking down at Syria and the rubble. It's all rubble, according to Dana Stroul. Aaron, I don't know if there's anything.
Okay, you silenced me. You silenced me.
Well, look, on the vote too. I mean, were the Syrians who voted abroad, like in Lebanon, who tried to vote in Germany and France, were they forced to go vote too? Did Assad have his soldiers in Lebanon and Germany and France and elsewhere occupying them and force people to go out and vote for him at the embassies? No, it's impossible to stage this. And again, I can't speak for what percentage of the population support.
They were not allowed to. Sorry, they were not allowed to vote in in Europe and elsewhere. They were blocked from voting.
Right, they were blocked.
And in Lebanon,
they were
militias attacked them. In Lebanon, militias affiliated to Samir Ja'ja, the head of the Lebanese forces, who is a war criminal himself and who was involved in the massacres and the Palestinian refugee camps in 1982. His people beat up these Syrians and wrecked their cars when they were on their way to the embassy to vote.
Yeah.
So, go ahead, Aaron.
Well, and what I saw, look, I was brought to a couple of polling sites and I had a government escort, and I'm sure that those sites were chosen deliberately. It was a place of high turnout, lots of enthusiasm, versus not taking me to a place with lower turnout. But there's just no way that you could stage bustling scenes, people coming in from everywhere, talking to people, seeing their faces, hearing from them how happy they were to be voting. What a victory they thought it was that their country defeated the dirty war, that they're not still ruled by Jaish al-Islam and other fanatics. And it's to deny all that is it's that same form of authoritarianism, of U.S. authoritarianism, that tells Syrian people that they have no sovereignty, that we have the right to occupy their country, steal their oil, steal their food, sanction them, prevent them from importing medicines. That's the real authoritarianism that I'm concerned about. And seeing all those people coming out in defiance, whatever their political views are, it was heartening to me to see that show of defiance and resilience, because look, there is suffering. There's no denying that. As we've said, I mean, the government is doing fine. Leaders in Syria are doing fine. But the people are bearing the brunt of this, and fuel prices are skyrocketing. So people only get a small subsidy of fuel every single month, and there's only certain days when you can get it. And so if you miss it, you just can't get any fuel. A well-off friend of mine is able to avoid all that because he just pays someone 9 times the price of gas to go get it for him. But most people can't do that. So that's the people who are sanctions on the regime, as they're characterized, are really impacting.
We got to wrap up soon, and partly because I have to go. But it is an important point that Aaron makes, that the U.S. is essentially a global dictator, and when it talks about other countries, it doesn't, where it aims to produce change, it talks about bad behavior or bad actors as if it is an authoritarian father who's punishing the bad children. It doesn't talk about policy change. It does. Tony Blinken, who I call Tony Blinkskrieg, he doesn't issue statements and proclamations on his Twitter account about policies where the U.S. has disagreement. It's all about behavior, and the U.S. punishes them by assaulting their civilian population. So it is a global dictatorship, and it's our responsibility to take it on before we start wagging our fingers at people in the global South for their naughty leaders.
And Iran is evil because it sends fuel to Venezuela,
right,
when the Americans are trying to strangle them. And then Iran sends fuel to Syria. Just a few weeks ago, the country was shut down in Syria because there was no fuel. They'd run
Right.
out of fuel.
Right.
And the Iranians were desperately trying to get fuel to Syria, and they were meeting all sorts of obstacles, like with Venezuela. So Iran
Right.
is evil for giving fuel so that people can drive their cars and live their lives in Venezuela and Syria. But the United States is, everything is fine for supporting Colombia, for destabilizing Venezuela, for strangling Cuba, for destroying Libya, and for strangling Syria, Iran, and helping with the genocide in Yemen, and so on and so forth. And of
And in
course,
Gaza.
there's always Israel and in Gaza.
Yeah, so that relates directly to my next and I guess final question. As you pointed out, Iran is supplying all of these socialist and independent governments with assistance in times of dire need. It is absolutely remarkable what Iran has done with Venezuela, sending tankers of fuel. Venezuela is under siege, sending tankers of fuel 5,000 miles away to South America to support a socialist and engaging in trade, just completely legal bilateral trade on principle. It appears to be on political principle, which is why Iran is targeted by the US, why Iran is itself sanctioned. This says it all. But Gaza, we just saw a very remarkable scene take place. And Aaron definitely weigh in on this as well, where an Israeli general has just admitted that Israel had to enact a unilateral ceasefire because of the rocket fire it was taking from the Gaza Strip, the amount of resistance from Gaza. And the resistance factions in Gaza were fighting over Jerusalem. They were deterring Israel from stealing people's homes in Jerusalem and from attacking the Al-Aqsa compound, the third holiest site in Islam, and just attacking that defenseless Palestinian community there. And so Israel had to go in, the most powerful army supposedly in the Middle East with nuclear weapons and a blue water navy, was forced to declare a unilateral ceasefire against besieged guerrilla factions in the Gaza Strip. And at the end of that 11-day conflict, you saw Yahya Sinwar, the prime minister of the Gaza Strip, Ismail Haniyeh, his predecessor, Abu Ubaidah, the spokesman for the armed wing of Hamas, a who's who, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a who's who of factions thanking Iran and saying, thank you for the know-how. Thank you for showing us how to wage this strategy against Israel as we fight to lift ourselves from siege and to liberate Palestine. I guess, what are your comments there? This is the most open acknowledgement of Iran and the resistance axis and its role in Gaza in history. And clearly something is taking place there that is shaking Israel and the US to its core.
Well, first of all, I'd like to remind your younger viewers who, although I think anyone who watches Gray Zone would know this, but that Iran's position on Israel, as I said earlier, is identical to its position, to what its position was on apartheid South Africa. And Iran supported the ANC and other opposition forces, and of course Nelson Mandela, who was the most important political prisoner in South Africa at that time. Whereas Western governments were supporting the apartheid regime. And Nelson Mandela, when he was released from prison and then he was elected to president, he was still, according to US law, a terrorist. And so was the ANC. His presidency finished, he retired from politics, and he was still a terrorist, according to US law. It was only in 2008, 9 years after his presidency ended, that he was removed from the terrorist list in the United States. And one of the first places that Mr. Mandela visited was Iran. And I actually was at the University of Tehran. I was a university student back then, and I was there when they gave him an honorary doctorate, so doctorate degree, or whatever it's called in English. So Iran's position on Palestine is identical. I mean, Netanyahu and other regime officials like to say that Iran wants to carry out to annihilate Israel, or to carry out genocide. against Israel, which is nonsense. Iran's position has always been that the apartheid regime has to end. And if it ends peacefully, and if it ends like South Africa, fine. But Iran does not accept this regime, not in the West Bank nor anywhere else as it stands. And I think now, after what the Israelis did, I think the worst damage that has been caused to the regime, to the Israeli regime in Gaza, was caused by the regime itself, by knocking out towers, by murdering people with impunity as the world watched. And we see how so many American Jews have been so vocal against the regime. And so I think that the Israeli regime is really undermining itself more than anyone else. You see the global public opinion, despite the media, despite Western governments trying to contain all this, that public opinion has turned against the regime. But Iran is supporting Gaza, and Iran is not, and Gaza is surrounded. So I think this is a major intelligence failure by the Israeli regime. It's a major military failure. They would not go into Gaza. Why? Because they knew that there were so many tunnels, hundreds of kilometers of tunnels underground, and the resistance, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and others, they were prepared. So the Israelis what they did was they preferred to just bomb houses. One moment, sorry, I'm running out of battery. Sorry about that. Am I okay now?
Looks good.
Okay. So Hamas and Islamic Jihad were victorious in the sense that they were able to prevent the Israelis from coming in. The Israeli regime destroyed its already destroyed reputation by just targeting buildings, the AP offices, quite well, and many Americans, and I'd like to stress the most important country that backs the Israeli regime is the United States by far. By far. I mean, without the United States, the regime would not last. It's not a strong regime. It's a small population, and they're subjugating a population of about the same size, and it's just through Western support that they sustain themselves. But they're destroying their image in the eyes of the globe and a global audience. And also Iran's the weaponry that Iran has given to Hamas and Islamic Jihad are by no means nearly as advanced as what Hezbollah has or what Iran's other allies have, simply because because Gaza is surrounded, and also because if anything is intercepted, that the Israelis would know what sort of technology Iran has. So imagine if this poor, impoverished, surrounded population in this concentration camp, and that Gazans are mostly refugees themselves. They are mostly from Palestine, and so they're in this concentration camp, living a miserable life, not allowed to leave, not allowed to import goods. It's a terrible life. But this small piece of land was able to stand its ground, even though the price that they paid was horrific. But they dented the Israeli regime badly because the Israelis couldn't defend themselves against their missiles, and they couldn't take the Gaza Strip because of the defenses. So the Israelis were humiliated. But I think the most amazing thing for me is, why did Netanyahu go in and start this war in the first place? And I think that itself reveals the lack of intelligence on behalf of the Israelis. The Israelis had no idea what was going on. Otherwise, they wouldn't have launched this war.
It was political desperation and this sense of inviolability, and now they have to think twice. I think deterrence was established when we saw Yahya Sinwar, the prime minister, walk home after the victory celebration that Hamas staged and say to the Israelis, "You know where I live. I'm going home." He was asserting the establishment of deterrence, and that was a pretty strong message, and it's also a message that reverberates around the region because there are much stronger military forces that Israel thinks it can take on, and it clearly can't. They're now lobbying in Congress for $1 billion for more Iron Dome batteries and armaments because apparently they ran out in the 11 days. It looks like they were running out and they need an emergency resupply. Again, another sign of weakness there. Aaron, is there anything you want to add before we sign off?
No, I've really appreciated listening to Professor Marandi's insights on background and everything else. I have nothing I can add that's of value.
Well, yeah, thanks for everything you did, and I think one of the most hilarious episodes. I just have to mention it. One of the most hilarious episodes, and since we really launched the Gray Zone, was the response to Anna Kasparian and Cenk Uyghur's they kind of committed social suicide by attacking you. So I think you established deterrence capacity as well with that. It really just shows
hard. It's not hard. That's
it shows the shifting. It shows the shifting landscape in media and where a lot of people are right now. And I think this is a different place than we were in 4 or 5 years ago with respect to a lot of these issues. I think a lot of people are more enlightened than they were before. And I hope this stream helped a lot. Thanks to Ben, who's off causing trouble in Nicaragua, for launching it. Thanks to everyone who supported us with super chats. Thanks for the excellent questions. Thank you, Professor Marandi, as always.
And I don't accept responsibility for anything that he does in Nicaragua. I'm not going to accept any responsibility.
Well, he's exuding darkness everywhere, so it must be rubbed off. Now we
and I actually found that Aaron was much more evil than me in Damascus. I mean, I just thought I was way behind. I was lagging behind.
Let me say too, by the way, about the Young Turks thing, that people had a good time making fun of these two people individually, but it's representative of a broader phenomenon. It's not just about them. Their McCarthyite meltdown just encapsulated how much leftist media has been co-opted by Russiagate and by the demonization of states that our regime decrees that we have the right to destroy. So me covering the OPCW scandal, in the demented mind of one of the TYT hosts, that becomes me defending the killing of children. Meanwhile, by the way, this is coming from a person who gave a fawning interview to Madeleine Albright, who openly celebrated the killing of children, of Iraqi children, when she said that
it was worth it.
It was worth it. The price was worth it.
Well, yeah, so, she was on a gig for like one of the most murderous forces in the history of humanity, which basically absorbed Nazi Germany after World War II.
Yes.
So, and what the hell? Their show is called The Young Turks. They're named after like this genocidal force that massacred Armenians, and she herself is Armenian. So, what me and Aaron, we're gonna go join a show called like The Young Nazis or like Young Hitler. Like, what the hell's wrong with you? Like, do you have any self-respect?
None.
So there's none.
But they wouldn't be able to say those demented words and say out loud that assert that I'm paid by the Russians, as Cenk Uyghur did, if that wasn't a part of a broader if that wasn't part of a broader deranged McCarthyite culture that's been normalized even in leftist circles, because they profess to be progressives. They're called the home of progressives, apparently. And I just want to say how glad I am to not be in that space, and how proud I am that we've resisted it from day one and shown how ridiculous it is. And I'm just heartened to see the response that people out there, everyone knows now that Russiagate, forever, maybe some people got excited by it at first. It seemed like there's something there, because it was so hyped up. But now everyone recognizes that it was a scam. And everyone recognizes that people who attack real journalism and just all they have to undermine it is name calling, tantrums, saying expletives, conspiracies that were paid by Russia, that were toadies for regimes. Everyone can see just how dishonest and how juvenile it is. And I'm heartened by the response to it. That was like the best part of this whole thing, just seeing, as Max said, just how many people made fun of these people. How many people are just tired of this juvenile behavior that passes as journalism by people who call themselves media professionals. And I think that was actually ultimately, as you know, as slanderous as it was, and as false as everything they said, I think it was important just to expose like the difference between people who take journalism seriously and people who just are in it for vanity and have no real connection to facts or even progressivism or even left-wing politics and just do it all for show. So that was my reaction to this thing, from what I could observe from afar, because again, I was in Syria as most of it was happening.
Well, that's all they've got. And actually, that's the line of attack on Ben right now in Nicaragua. So we'll just keep going forward. And I think we stand on the quality of our journalism. And if you can prove us wrong, you can prove that we're lying, then you can actually do some damage. But beyond that, just keep on tripping and keep on lipping, as Curtis Mayfield said. We got to go. Thank you again, Professor Marandi, non-Professor Maté.
Thank you all.
All right. Peace.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Marandi. See you soon.
Bye for now.